Over the next few days, things between them slowly began to change. Jimin started coming home earlier, joining her for dinner instead of locking himself away in his office. Their conversations were hesitant at first, small talk about the garden or the weather. But slowly, they grew longer, deeper. One evening, as they sat on the patio watching the sunset, Jimin spoke up.
I've been thinking,
he said, his tone more relaxed than she had ever heard it.
about the baby.
Yen's breath caught, but she didn't stop him.
I don't want to rush anything.
He continued, his eyes soft as they met hers.
But I want you to know that if you ever want to try again for a family, I'd like that.
Her heart clenched at the mention of their lost child, but for the first time, she didn't feel completely crushed by the weight of it. There was a flicker of something else, hope.
Maybe one day,
she said softly, her hand resting on his.
but right now, I just want us to work on us.
Jimin nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips.
Us.
He repeated.
That sounds perfect.
As the weeks passed, the walls between them continued to fall. Jimin wasn't perfect, he still had moments where his old coldness surfaced, moments where he withdrew out of habit. But each time, he made an effort to come back to her, to open up, to show her that he was trying. And slowly, Yen found herself softening toward him, too. The resentment that had once consumed her began to fade, replaced by a tentative trust. She saw the man he was becoming, the effort he was putting into their relationship. And it was enough for now. Late one night, as they lay in bed, Yen turned to him and whispered.
Jimin?
He was half asleep, but she could hear the alertness in his voice.
I think I'm starting to believe you.
She said, her voice so quiet she wasn't sure he'd heard. But then he reached out, pulling her gently into his arms, and she felt the warmth of his embrace wrap around her.
I'm glad.
He murmured against her hair.
I'll keep showing you, Yen, every day.
And for the first time since the miscarriage, Yen felt like maybe, just maybe, they had a future worth fighting for. Together. Months had passed since that night when Jimin had first opened up to her, and their relationship had begun to heal. Slowly, piece by piece, they rebuilt what was once cold and distant. Jimin's presence became a source of warmth in Yen's life. He was no longer the man who stood at a distance, but the husband who sat beside her, held her hand, and listened. One crisp morning, Yen woke up feeling different. There was a subtle shift in her body, a fluttering in her stomach, a sensation that made her pause as she brushed her hand over her abdomen. Her heart raced as she calculated the days in her head. Could it be? Later that day, she nervously clutched the pregnancy test, the tiny window revealing 2 pink lines. Yen's breath caught in her throat as tears welled up in her eyes. She was pregnant. After everything, after the pain and the loss, life had given them a second chance. Yen heard the front door open, and Jimin's familiar footsteps approached. She stood in the living room, her hands trembling slightly as she held the test behind her back. He walked in, his expression softening when he saw her.
Hey.
He said, stepping closer and gently brushing a strand of hair from her face.
You look different today. Is everything okay?
Yen smiled, her eyes brimming with unshed tears.
I have something to tell you.
Jimin's brow furrowed in concern.
What is it?
Without a word, she pulled the test from behind her back and handed it to him. His eyes scanned the tiny lines, and for a moment, he didn't react. Then, his gaze lifted to meet hers, wide with disbelief.
Are you...
His voice was barely a whisper, filled with hope and uncertainty. YN nodded, her tears finally spilling over.
We're pregnant, Jimin. We're going to have a baby.
Jimin's face transformed, the stoic mask he once wore cracking completely as joy flooded his features. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if he couldn't believe it was real.
When? Oh my God, when?
His voice broke as he pressed A to her forehead.
I can't believe it.
They stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, feeling the weight of their journey, the pain, the healing, the hope, culminating in this moment. Jimin pulled back slightly, his hands resting gently on her stomach.
I promise you.
He whispered, his voice thick with emotion.
I'll be there every step of the way. For you, for the baby, for our family.
YN smiled, her heart full for the first time in so long.
I know you will.
She whispered, resting her hand over his. As they stood together, holding on to this new beginning, YN realized that the walls between them had finally crumbled. In their place was something stronger, something filled with love, hope, and a future they would now share together. They weren't just two strangers bound by a contract anymore. They were a family.